So we ended this morning talking about the money multiplier process, right? And how that works. And basically, the insight there was that when the Fed creates new money, it also creates new lending, which then in turn creates new deposits, which creates new lending, new deposits, new lending. And so whenever the Fed creates new money, you actually get big changes in the money supply, right? You can get bigger changes in the money supply. And that's what we call the money multiplier. And so we talked through all of that this morning. So we talked a lot, or mentioned a lot this morning, the words the Federal Reserve and central banking, but that we did not really talk in much detail about what the Federal Reserve is and what a central bank is. And so that's the main purpose of our discussion here this afternoon, is to talk about the Fed. Oh, shoot. For a second, I thought it wasn't working, right? So let's talk about the Fed. Oops. Now my Apple Pen is not working. Really just amazing, isn't it? Okay, can you all talk amongst yourself for a minute? I think somebody else in my house has an Apple Pen. Let me see if I can conceivably find theirs. So hold on one moment. Sorry about this. Probably not charged. Damn it. All right, back up Apple Pen. I don't know that this is synced up though. So just give me a minute, okay? We'll see if we can get this to work. All right, no, it's not connecting. Well, you know, do what we can, folks. I really don't know what I can do to provide a better class experience for everybody when none of the tools I have are working. So anyway, well, so, I would like to use this iPad, but let's just try to, I guess I'll just show you my notes. Okay. So the Federal Reserve System, right? The Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve is a central bank, okay? It is the United States central bank. What is a central bank? Well, I mean, I guess the more technical definition is that a central bank is really an institution that oversees the banking system and regulates the money supply. Okay, it's an institution that oversees the banking system and regulates the money supply. But I think a more intuitive explanation of what the central bank is it's a bank for banks. Okay, a central bank is a bank for banks. Who are the customers of the central bank? Banks are the customers, banks and the government, right? It's a bank for governments and it's a bank for banks. I really should add this here, a bank for banks and a bank for governments. So normal people, average people do not have accounts at the Federal Reserve. Who has accounts at the Federal Reserve? Banks have accounts at the Federal Reserve. And the federal government has an account at the Federal Reserve. So the central bank is the bank of this federal government and a bank for banks. Before we talk about what exactly the Federal Reserve does, let's just kind of talk about how it's organized. And the makeup of the Federal Reserve is quite complicated. And in part, the complicated nature of the Federal Reserve reflects the very complicated relationship that Americans have had with banking and central banking. What do I mean by a complicated relationship? Listen, Americans have been skeptical of big banks, right? The founding fathers were very skeptical of central banking. So, one of the things that is not in the US Constitution is the Federal Reserve is not in the US Constitution, and in part because the founding fathers couldn't really agree upon what a central bank should look like. The founding fathers, many of them viewed the central bank of England, right, called the Bank of England, as really a tool of powerful, wealthy interests, a tool of industrialists, and not always working in the interest of farmers. And, most of the founding fathers were farmers, right? And so they were very skeptical of central banks. And so, you've all seen Hamilton, hopefully, right? Alexander Hamilton was kind of in many ways, the proponent that the US needed a strong financial system and we needed a central bank. But he didn't really win that argument. And so for most of US history, we did not have a central bank. And as a result, when banks needed a loan, there was no place for them to go to. When banks needed money, they did not have a central bank that they could go to. The federal government did not have a bank that could help the federal government raise money during wars and et cetera. And there was very little regulation of the US financial system. So basically in 1914, the Federal Reserve was set up. In 1914, Federal Reserve started as basically a system of 12 regional banks. I'm sorry, 1913. And so the 1913 Federal Reserve Act, right, which is an act of Congress, it's not in the Constitution, created the Federal Reserve. And this was basically 13 regional banks. I'm sorry, 12 regional banks, right? 12 regional banks. Here was the compromise that members of Congress made. We are afraid of having 12 banks. Or I'm sorry, we are afraid of having one big central bank. So how do we minimize that fear? Let's make 12 smaller central banks. And so basically the system was very decentralized. Because of this suspicion of big banking, they created a very decentralized system in which power was kind of diffused across the country. And so here you can see a map, and these Federal Reserve district banks still exist today, and you can see where they are, right? In Boston, New York, Philadelphia, right? All these dots are where there's a Federal Reserve district bank. And then you can also see the shaded area is where they basically do their business, right? So we are here in Iowa, we're in the Chicago district. What that means is that the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago is our regional Federal Reserve Bank. So banks in Iowa, when they deposit required reserves, they do it at the Chicago Fed. Now you can see this map really doesn't make a ton of sense today, in the sense that this really reflects the United States of 1913 much more than it does today. And by that, I mean, for instance, there's only one Federal Reserve Bank west of Dallas, and that's San Francisco, right? So you see San Francisco got this huge area, while if you look in Missouri, there's two Federal Reserve Banks in Missouri, one in St. Louis and one in Kansas City. It doesn't make much sense, right? But, once again, this kind of reflects the United States of 1913 more than it does today. Okay. And so these regional banks were the way that the Federal Reserve began. And the idea here was that this was going to decentralize power and kind of keep each of these individual Federal Reserve banks working separately and, kind of reduce their individual power and of course the opportunity for their power to be abused. How did this system work? Pretty miserably. Pretty miserably, for a couple of reasons. First off, you need coordination in policy. And particularly in the early days, San Francisco's a long way from New York. And so many of these banks would work at cross purposes. Many of these banks really were run by local bankers that didn't really have much idea what they were doing. And so the Federal Reserve was really fairly incompetent during its early days. It didn't serve many of the functions that we're going to talk about here in a minute that we know today central banks need to serve. And so as a result, it really didn't do much good, and particularly during the Great Depression, where the Fed's performance during the Great Depression was pretty miserable. The Fed did a lot of things that we know today to be exactly the opposite of what you're supposed to do. For instance, as we've talked about, they raised interest rates during the Great Depression. They let many banks fail as opposed to being a lender of last resort, because with as little knowledge as they had of the economy, they figured, oh, well, those banks have got to be bad. If they're failing, they've got to be bad, so just let them go. And so the Federal Reserve was the performance was pretty bad. So what happened after the Great Depression? Well, one of the elements of the New Deal was that the Federal Reserve power was centralized. And it was centralized in two ways. First, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors was created. And what the Board of Governors is it's essentially like an executive committee that sits on top of the regional banks. So this Board of Governors is located in Washington, D.C. For those of you who have gone on field trips or whatever, the D.C., if you know where the Supreme Court is, the Federal Reserve Board is right across the street from the Supreme Court. And Innis sets the 7 Board of Governors, right? And so who are these governors? There's 7 of them, and they have 14-year terms. How do you get to be a governor? You have to be appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, right? So in many ways, the Board of Governors looks a lot like the Supreme Court. You're appointed by the president, you're confirmed by the Senate. While in the Supreme Court, you have a lifetime appointment. In the Board of Governors, you have a 14-year appointment. Still pretty good. Okay, so now of these governors, one is appointed a chair that has a 4-year term, and that currently is Jerome Powell. Jerome Powell was appointed by President Trump in 2017. All right, so he's actually coming, I believe, sometime this year, toward the end of this year. His 4-year term is coming up, and he could be reappointed, right? Chairman of the Federal Reserve can be reappointed for additional terms, but when you're appointed and confirmed, you're there for 4 years. And so, as I said, this Board of Governors was really created in a response to the Great Depression because the Fed was so incoherent and incompetent. So the Board of the Governors is in many ways the managers of the Federal Reserve that kind of coordinate policy, collect data from all across the country, and try to make sure that all of the regional banks are kind of on the same page. Now, there's another important part of the Federal Reserve that you have to understand, and that's the Federal Open Market Committee. This is a group of people who work within the Fed. All right, so the Federal Open Market Committee is a committee within the Fed. And who is on this committee? It's those 7 Board of Governors. It's the New York Fed president. And then it's 4 of the 11 other regional presidents on a rotating basis. Okay, so there's 12 people on this board. 7 of them are the Board of Governors. 1 is the New York Fed, and then 4 of the other 11 that rotate amongst themselves. This is the group that actually sets monetary policy. Okay, so in terms of the big decisions related to monetary policy, this is the group that sets it. So they meet in DC every 6 weeks. There's a huge table in the Board of Governors, and along this table, basically the board of governors sit down, they bring their pet economists with them, and they make decisions about what monetary policy is going to be for the next 6 weeks. Now, one of the things I want you to pay attention to on this Federal Open Market Committee is that the majority of this committee is the Board of Governors. So the Board of Governors is the majority power in the Federal Open Market Committee. And it is really the Board of Governors where most, I want to say all, but at least most of the power in the Federal Reserve is centralized, okay? So while these regional banks are important and they do have a say in monetary policy and they do have they have a role in implementing monetary policy, let's be clear, it's the Board of Governors that really call the shots. Right? It's really the Board of Governors that call the shots. And of those Board of Governors, which one is the most important? Well, the chairman. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. First off, it's the chairman that's on the news, right? It's the chairman that people know their face and see him on television. But also, as we'll talk about, the Fed is a fairly consensus-orientated place. Unlike the rest of Washington, the Fed tends to function pretty well. And so because consensus is so important amongst the people who work in the Fed, that does create a lot of kind of internal pressure to, kind of come up with solutions that everybody can agree to. And then as a result, that gives the chairman a lot of power. And so the chairman of the Fed has a great deal of power in terms of helping to shape monetary policy. What is it that a central bank does? Every modern country has a central bank. Okay, in the United States, we call ours the Federal Reserve System. In England, it's the Bank of England. In Canada, it's the Bank of Canada. In Japan, it's the Bank of Japan. In Europe, it's the European Central Bank, right? So in China, it's the People's Bank of China, right? So every modern economy has a central bank. And the reason why economies need central bank is because there's very important functions that central banks fill that cannot be filled by any other institution within an economy. And so let's talk about what these important responsibilities are for central banks. The first one is that central banks are a bank for banks. In other words, banks need banking services too. And so what the central bank does is they give individual banks the access to banking services. For instance, central banks hold required reserves. So a central bank is a place where a bank can hold reserves. Very importantly, what central banks do is they clear interbank payments. And what do I mean by this? Banks all the time are exchanging money as their customers make trades. It's the central bank that helps banks do this very quickly. So just to give you an example here, let's say that your roommate's from California and they write you a check and you go deposit that check at Hills Bank in Mount Vernon, okay? How in the world is the money going to get from your California bank, from your neighbor's or your roommate's California bank to your Hills Bank in Mount Vernon? Very simply. Hills Bank takes that check, they scan it, the scan goes to the Chicago Fed. What does the Chicago Fed do? They take money out of the California bank account, they put it in the Hills Bank account, the check is cleared, right? So instead of taking, in the old days or even weeks to clear checks, the Fed now can clear checks almost instantaneously. I mean, almost as the second you deposit that check, it's going to get scanned and changed in the Federal Reserve System. And so by clearing interbank payments, this just makes trade easier, right? It makes it faster. The Fed also runs what's called the discount lending window. And what's that? This is when banks can borrow money from the Fed. If banks need a loan, one of the places that they can go is the Fed. And so when I have LOLR there, what I'm talking about is the lender of last resort, right? The Fed is a lender of last resort. So if banks can't get money from anybody else, they can always get money from the Fed. However, let's be clear. The Fed is a lender of last resort. The Fed is not a lender of first resort. What happens if a bank needs to borrow money? Going to the Fed is not the first option. The first option for banks is something called the federal funds market. And what is the federal funds market? This is basically a market where banks lend their excess reserves to other banks. So as we talked about this morning, banks have excess reserves, right? They have excess reserves and they lend them out. One of the areas or one of the ways that banks lend out money is they lend to other banks, right? So if another bank is short of reserves, they can actually borrow those reserves from another bank. And that's what's called the federal funds market. And so, once again, the federal funds market is the lender of first resort, and the Fed is the lender of last resort. If a bank can't get money in the federal funds market, then they can borrow the money from the Fed. And that's called the discount window lending. And why it's called discount window, there's a long, boring history of it that you're not interested in, right? But that's just a little bit of lingo that you should be familiar with. So don't confuse these two things. The discount window lending is something different from federal funds lending, right? Federal funds lending is lender of first resort. Discount window is lender of last resort. What does the Fed's balance sheet look like? Well, first off, on the right-hand side on the liabilities, you have the ways that the Fed raises money. And how do they raise money? By basically putting currency into circulation or putting bank reserves into circulation. How do they put currency into circulation? They print it up. How do they put bank reserves into circulation? They add it to your account. They add it to a bank account. So basically, liabilities the Fed can create out of thin air. That's the beauty of being a central bank. You can create money, or at least the monetary base, out of thin air. And as we're going to talk about, what does the Fed do with this money? A lot of it they put in treasury bills, and I'll explain this here in a little bit. Okay, so just kind of file this balance sheet away for a moment, and then I'm going to, as I said, we'll come back and we'll try to explain this a little bit better. So that's the first big responsibility of a central bank, is that they essentially serve as a bank for banks. Next, they serve as the regulator of banks. The Fed has always, central banks have always been regulators, but in modern economies, and particularly in the US economy, the Federal Reserve in particular has really seen its power of regulation increase over time. So after the global financial crisis, after the global financial crisis of 2008, a big financial reform act was passed in 2010 called the Frank-Dodd Financial Reform Act. And one of the big components of this Financial Reform Act was now that the Fed is the regulator of the entire financial system. They are the systematic regulator of the entire financial system. So who's the principal regulator of the financial system? The Fed. And so Fed does a lot of regulation, including things like setting required reserves, setting loan standards, what kind of loans banks can give, what kind of loans they can't give, what kind of information banks have to report about their activities. They do assessments of bank risk. So they produce a lot of information and basically share that with people in the market, so that people who invest in banks, or just, anybody who's in the US financial system, can get information about what's happening at a specific bank. And the idea here, once again, is to reduce moral hazard, meaning the Fed is trying to regulate banks so that they don't engage in extremely risky behavior. As we talked about, the Fed is the lender of last resort for banks. So unlike any other corporation, banks just don't go bankrupt, right? We don't let banks go bankrupt, because if they go bankrupt, they're going to take down other banks with them. And they're going to take down our deposits and our wealth. So there's a societal interest in not letting banks go bankrupt. But what's the problem? If we never let banks go bankrupt, that creates moral hazard. And what that means is that banks could have incentives to engage in risky behavior. And so that's the reason why banks are regulated by the Fed, right? They're regulated to prevent them from engaging in very, very risky behavior. Now, I do want to be clear about this. The Fed doesn't have to lend to a bank. But if the Fed doesn't lend, that bank is going to go out of business. And often what that means is when banks go out of business, it then becomes the responsibility of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And so it's the FDIC that then bails out depositors and kind of closes up the bank and lets that bank go out of business, right? So the Fed isn't, when I say the Fed's the lender of last resort, it doesn't mean the Fed has to lend, right? The Fed will make a judgment. Is this a good bank that just needs a loan, or is this a bad bank? If they decide it's a bad bank, they will let it fail, right? But importantly, letting a bank fail doesn't mean that depositors won't get paid back, because that's the purpose of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So that's the second big function of a central bank is bank regulation. The third big function is the Federal Reserve is the bank of the US Treasury, right? It's a bank for government. So if any of you are lucky enough to get your tax refunds here in a couple of weeks or a couple of months, where will that tax refund be? Who will write that tax refund check? The Federal Reserve. All right, so essentially the Fed takes care of the banking responsibilities for the Fed. So whenever the federal government makes a payment or whenever the Fed receives money, it's all handled by the Fed, okay? That doesn't mean that the Fed sets fiscal policy, though. And this is a really, really important point. It's not the Fed that sets fiscal policy. The Fed doesn't decide government spending. It doesn't decide taxes. It doesn't decide how much we borrow. That's the responsibility of the president and Congress. The Fed just acts like a bank, right? The Fed just does the transactional business, right? They do the transactional business of the federal government. They don't run things. And then finally, and this is the part that we have to spend more time talking about here, the last responsibility of any central bank is to set monetary policy. And so that's where we need to move to next. How exactly does the Fed set monetary and run monetary policy? Well, the Fed has many tools at its disposal. The Fed could go out in a golden helicopter and drop money out the window, and that would be one way to increase the money supply. Or they could, go out there and steal money out of people's wallets and chop it up and cut the money supply that way. But those are probably not the best ways to go about changing the money supply. So, what are the mechanics of the Fed changing the money supply? Well, the Fed has many tools, but the primary tool that they use is something called open market operations. And so let's move on to talking about open market operations and what we mean by open market operations. Okay, what is open market operations? It's just simply the Fed buying and selling treasury bills. The Fed buying and selling treasury bills. So every day at 11:10 a.m., all the markets know this, the Federal Reserve conducts their open market operation of the day. So let's just say hypothetically that today, the Fed announces that they want to buy $100 million of treasury bills, right? They want to buy $100 million of treasury bills. In other words, they're going to conduct an open market purchase. They're going to conduct an open market purchase of treasury bills. How do they do that? The Fed sends out an announcement to all the banks. The Fed usually does this with the New York banks because the New York financial markets are the biggest. And they say, hey, we want to buy $100 million of treasury bills. And then the banks send them back a response. They say, sure, we'll send you 50 million. Or another bank will say, I'll sell you 30 million. Another bank will say, I'll sell you 80 million. The Fed will look at the prices. They'll pick the best prices, but there's really not much difference in prices because these are very competitive markets, right? So there's a market price that's readily available. The Fed will see which banks they're going to buy from, and they hit a button, boom, that's it. What's happened to the money supply? Well, what happened when the Fed hit that button? They bought treasury bills. What did they pay for those treasury bills with? New money. Money that never existed before. So when the Fed conducts an open market purchase, in other words, when they buy treasury bills, they are increasing the monetary base. They are creating new money. Now, if it helps you sleep at night, you can think about the Fed saying, we buy the treasury bills and they fill up a Brink truck full of stacks of money and they take it down to the bank and they give the bank the money. But that's not really how it works. Is there actually any physical money that trades hands? No physical money trades hands. The Fed just puts money in the bank's account. The Fed just gives the bank reserves. So they go right into the bank's balance sheet and they say, there, now you have less T-bills and you have more reserves, right? So if you can see here, look on the left-hand side here and look at the treasury account or the T account of commercial banks. What happens when the Fed conducts an open market purchase of 100 million? The banks lose treasury bills, and what do they get in return? Reserves. They get reserves. And those are now reserves that the bank can lend out. And what happens when they lend it out? It begins to increase the money supply through that money multiplier process that we talked about. Okay? So, yeah, this is how the Fed goes about increasing the money supply. They buy treasury bills. And how do they pay for them? With brand new money, right? New reserves that never existed before. What happens when the Fed conducts an open market sale? It's really the exact opposite. Now the Fed sells a T-bill, and what do? They take money out of circulation and they make money disappear. When they do that, the money multiplier process works in reverse and the money supply goes down. Okay? So this is how the Fed typically changes the money supply, right? This is the way that the Fed typically chooses to do business. And as I said, the Fed does this every day, right? The Fed is very good at doing this, right? And big banks know that the Fed does this every day. And so this is part of the big bank's business, is buying and selling with the Federal Reserve. So once again, if the Fed wants to increase the money supply, they conduct open market purchases. And if they want to reduce the money supply, they conduct open market sales. And the Fed doesn't usually do this actually with physical money. They just do this electronically, right? They do this with, by just adding money to a bank's account. Why does the Fed choose to use this as the method of controlling the money supply? Well, I mean, could they drop money out of a golden helicopter? They could, but that's not a particularly fair way of distributing money, right? So, just dropping money on the economy is not particularly fair. Could the Fed get on eBay and buy and sell action figures, Star Wars action figures from the 1980s? well, I guess they could in theory. The practice is the Fed needs to make big transactions, right? 10 million, $100 million. Is it possible to buy that many action figures? Not really, right? I mean, the Fed needs a very big liquid market to be working in. And that's exactly why they choose treasury bills, is because these are some of the biggest, most liquid markets in the world. And the Fed can make lots of sales very quickly if they need to. And so that's the reason why the Fed chooses to work through open market operations, is because this is just very easy. And so, if you consider the advantages of open market operations, this is appealing to the Fed because it's easy. The Fed can make big changes or it can make small changes. And the Fed, for the Fed, this is very predictable. And what I mean by that is the Fed knows how this works. They've been doing this for so long that they have a very good handle on how open market operations actually work. One thing we should note, though, is at the end of this process, the Fed gets something. And what is it that they get? When they conduct a lot of open market purchases, they actually hold treasury bills, right? So the Fed ends up buying a fairly big amount of US government debt. And we talked about this yesterday when we talked about that the government owns 20% of all of its own debt. And by government, who is that mainly? It's the Federal Reserve, right? The Federal Reserve owns a big chunk of US debt. And they've bought it through open market operations. What does the Fed do with that money? Well, basically the Fed uses that money to pay its bills, and then they return the rest of it to the Treasury. So in other words, they give it back to taxpayers, as they should, right? As they should. But as we're going to talk about a little bit later, not every central bank does the same thing. And in some countries, the central bank, their primary goal is to pay their bills, right? And so many central banks, when their treasury issues a bond, the central bank goes right out and buys it up and takes it off the market. And, the problem with doing that is if you do it too much, you're going to print up too much money and it's going to lead to inflation, as we'll talk about more a little bit tomorrow. And so, the Federal Reserve, they make a lot of money. They literally make a lot of money. Literally, they make a lot of money. And they use this money primarily to buy U.S. Treasury bills, and return the money back to the taxpayer. And so in that sense, the Treasury bills are really just a conduit for the Fed to put money into the U.S. economy, right? In a fairer way than just dropping money out of a helicopter. Are there other things that the Fed sometimes does, though, other than open market operations? Yeah. The Fed doesn't always buy T-bills. Sometimes they will buy other assets in an effort to try to stabilize the market. Some of you might be familiar with quantitative easing. Quantitative easing was a big program that the Fed enacted in 2008. And what this was involved is instead of trying to buy T-bills, remember T-bills are short-term bonds, the government got heavily involved in buying long-term bonds in an effort to try to drive down long-term interest rates. And so the Fed doesn't always just buy and sell T-bills. As I said, during the quantitative easing stage, the Fed did this. And actually, the Fed has gone back to doing this a little bit during COVID, where the Fed has actually been buying other kind of assets. During 2008, the Fed bought a bunch of mortgage-backed securities. And so instead of buying T-bills, they bought mortgage-backed securities. In this figure here, you can see what happened to the Fed's balance sheet. Basically, the Fed expanded the size of its asset by 4 times between 2007 and 2011, right? They rapidly bought assets. And how did they buy all those assets? By rapidly increasing the money supply, right? So the Fed printed up a lot of money and they bought these assets. And as we're going to talk a little bit more tomorrow, what was the goal? The goal was to try to stabilize markets, right? By providing some demand. Many of these mortgage-backed securities, the demand had just dropped to zero for them. And so how did the Fed stabilize markets? The Fed went in and bought stuff. So you can see how the Fed provided a lot of liquidity to the financial system. And you can see how the Fed's doing it again in 2020, right? If you look out here at the end, once again, the Fed here has been buying, they've been providing liquidity, making loans to banks. They've been buying long-term bonds. They've been buying short-term bonds. They've been buying other kind of assets. Once again, trying to create liquidity and keep the financial system moving. And, once again, where did the Fed get all this money? It's nice to be the Fed, right? They just printed it up, right? They just printed it up. The Fed essentially created more than $3 trillion in new money. And they're going to do it again during COVID. They are doing it again during COVID, right? Where I think they've created more than more than $1 trillion in the middle of last year during the COVID crisis. And so the Fed has this power of essentially creating money to try to stabilize financial systems, to make sure that people can get loans, that people who need money can get it so that the whole thing doesn't stop, doesn't grind to a halt. Does all of this money creation mean that the US is some sort of outlier or that they're doing something not right? And no. I mean, listen, different countries differ in terms of what their money supply is. If you just look at currency and circulation in the United States, we don't really we're pretty much average among most other developed countries, right? The US doesn't have, we're not awash in cash, despite the fact that the Fed has greatly increased the money supply. We have about, I would like to let you go here by about 1:30. So in our last couple of minutes, let's just talk about some other tools that the Fed has to change the money supply. Because there's other ways that the Fed could control the money supply or influence the money supply. These other tools, though, are not tools that the Fed usually uses, okay? And so while I want to talk about these really quickly, let's just be clear, these are not things that the Fed does a lot. One way that the Fed could change the money supply is they could change the reserve requirement ratio. So for instance, if the Fed wanted to increase the money supply, they could cut the amount of reserves that banks had to hold. What would that do? That would encourage banks to lend out all those reserves that they no longer had to hold. So it would really increase that money multiplier. The Fed doesn't do this, right? And why don't they do this? First off, it would lead to unpredictable changes, right? Remember, the Fed is a bunch of conservative bankers. They don't want to do anything big. They would prefer to do smaller things as opposed to big things. And so they tend to avoid this because they don't want to make unpredictable changes. The other reason they don't like to do this is because actually this would be hard on banks. Banks do a lot of planning to keep their reserves at the required amount that they need, and really not a penny more, right? Not a penny more. Banks are very good at barely meeting their required reserve ratio and not having very few excess reserves. And so if their target was always changing, this would mess this up for banks, right? Who spend a lot of time and effort trying to keep their required reserves to a minimum. Listen, if you don't think that banks are good at keeping excess reserves to zero, just pay attention to this. I don't know if any of you like to read the newspaper or follow the news. Just pay attention to the next time you hear that somebody robbed a bank, how much money they got away with, right? I mean, it's always hilarious to me that there's still people out there robbing banks, not realizing that there's very little money in banks, right? Banks do a very, very good job of keeping the amount of money that's actually there to an absolute minimum. Because any money that's just sitting around there is not making money, right? So, just pay attention to this. Next time you see a story or go online, right? I should have done this before class. Go online, get some story about somebody robbing a bank recently. And you'll see, yeah, the perpetrator got away with $6,000. perpetrator got away with $11,000. I mean, that's not a lot of money, right? Not a lot of money for the risk you're taking. And it just goes to show you how good the banks are at keeping these excess reserves to a minimum. The other way that the Fed could control the money supply is through discount lending, meaning lending to banks. So the Fed could do its business through just doing lending. Because where does the money for lending come from? The Fed just prints it up. However, as I said, in reality, this is not really the way that the Fed does business, in part because the Fed does not want to be the lender of first resort. The Fed wants to be the lender of last resort. And so on a day-to-day basis, banks do not borrow from the Fed. Borrowing from the Fed is an extraordinary event. It's not an ordinary event. And so when the Fed does lend, they create new money, but the Fed really doesn't do a lot of lending. As a practical matter, they really don't lend. Because as I said, the Fed really wants this to be an extraordinary event. And so ordinarily, if banks need some money, they're really encouraged to go to that federal funds market. In other words, they're really encouraged to go to other banks. Okay. One last thing here from chapter 14. As I said, every central bank has their own, every country has their own central bank. One interesting central bank for us to spend just a minute or two thinking about is the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank is really the bank of the euro, right? So all of the European countries that are in the euro area have adopted a single central bank that manages their single currency, the euro. And so there's 13 different countries in the European Central Bank. So how exactly is the European Central Bank set up? So let's think about it. When Europe set up the euro in 2000, they had different countries that were somewhat skeptical of centralized power. So you have a group of states that need a central bank, but they're skeptical of centralized power. Can anybody think of a model for the European Central Bank that might work? The Fed, right? I mean, the Fed is basically the model for the European Central Bank. There's a national bank located in each country, very much like we have a regional central bank. And then there's a European Central Bank, meaning kind of like equivalent of our Board of Governors, that's located in Frankfurt, Germany, like our Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. And so the European Central Bank is very, very much modeled along the lines of the Fed. And so that's actually very useful to know because as we're going to go along, I'm going to talk about the European Central Bank quite a bit the next couple of days, in part because it's interesting to think about how monetary policy differs in different countries and how it could look different from one part to another. But once we understand the Fed, we also have a really good understanding of the European Central Bank, because really the European Central Bank is really organized in many ways, very much like the Fed, right? Very much like the Fed. So that's really chapter 14. All right, chapter 14, I would say, is a lot of institutional stuff, talking about the kind of nuts and bolts of what the Fed is and what monetary policy is. So where we're going to move tomorrow in chapter 15 is we're going to step back and now let's think about the big picture. How should central banks run monetary policy, right? When should they conduct open market operations? When should they be trying to increase the money supply? How does that impact interest rates? How do interest rates impact the economy? And so a lot of what we do tomorrow is really connecting what we talked about today to what we talked about with our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, right? That's really where we're gonna move. For your exam on Thursday, though, this is going to be the cutoff for the material on your exam on Thursday. Okay, so what we talk about tomorrow in chapter 15 will not be on Thursday's exam. So the exam really covers everything up to this point. So just so that you know what's on the exam, this will include chapter 9 on long run growth, our discussion about economic inequality, chapter 12 on aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, chapter 13 on fiscal policy, and chapter 14 on money and the Fed. That's the material for the second exam. Okay, so what we talk about tomorrow actually is, in many ways, is a really good review for the exam because we're going to be talking about the same kind of things, but the material tomorrow will not explicitly be on the exam. Okay, it will not explicitly be on the exam, even though it's closely tied to a lot of the things that will be on the exam. Okay, so is everybody kind of clear on what's going to be on the exam on Thursday? So as I said, tomorrow morning we will go over chapter 15. We will talk about quiz number 4, and then we'll have some time to review in the afternoon. And so definitely spend some time tonight thinking about questions, bringing questions, so that we have something to talk about tomorrow afternoon. Because I'm not going to have an organized review session in the sense that I'm going to decide what we talk about. I'm going to kind of leave it up to you to decide what we talk about. Okay. Okay, any other questions before I let you all go? Okay, well, I know I was going to talk to a couple of you if you want to just stick around here afterwards, and we'll go in the breakout rooms and talk. But for the rest of you, thanks a lot. Have a good afternoon, and we'll see you tomorrow morning. Hey, Aiden. Actually, Michael, Aiden talked to me about talking with me first. So I'm going to put you in a breakout room, okay? And I'll come get you in a minute.